Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Friday, January 26th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Akron game is in 218 days. The game against Michigan in 309 days. Jim Harbaugh is officially the coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. They moved from San Diego, as you may have heard. Jim Harbaugh is moving there as well. So now the question is, what kind of fallout will there be for the Michigan program? And there's a whole NCAA conversation to have there, but there's also a transfer portal conversation to have there because, of course, as we have seen with other teams that have lost their coaches in the last few weeks, there is a 30-day transfer portal window that opens up if your head coach leaves. We saw that at Alabama. We saw that at Washington. You're seeing that at Arizona. And now you're going to see that at Michigan as well. So what is that going to look like? And are any of those guys going to end up at Ohio State? That sounds like a little bit of an inflammatory question, but we're asking for reasons we'll get into in a minute. But we're going to welcome in Tony Gerdeman of BuckeyeHuddle.com. He would never transfer on us to another podcast. Tony, welcome. Let's just start with this. We saw it happen to Alabama. A bunch of very talented players hitting the portal as soon as Nick Saban left and heading to other destinations around college football. Is that going to happen at Michigan? And, why or why not?
Well, I don't think it will for a couple of reasons. For one, I don't think the talent pool is as great at Michigan as it was at Alabama. And so while these players could have options if they jump into the portal, I don't think that they would be as wide and as prestigious as the players from Alabama. Now, there are certainly some players from Michigan, as we'll talk about, who could. But I also think that if the reports are true and that Sherrone Moore is the guy that gets the job, you're trying to keep the band together as much as you can, like when the lead singer leaves. And this is basically Steve Perry leaving Journey. And let's just continue to try and keep Journey going type of thing. And Sherrone Moore, now the lead singer of Journey, and just trying to keep people from jumping into the portal. And we've seen former players, current players even saying, give it to Sherrone, give the job to Sherrone Moore. And so it seems like that aspect of it, the familiarity, nothing is really changing. The head coach is changing, but for the offensive guys, not much else. So like, why hit the portal? Defensive guys will maybe have to have a different talk because they may be losing their defensive coordinator. So we'll see what that looks like. But I think the familiarity keeps players from bolting, certainly as much as, less than they did or more than they did from Alabama, because that's just, I think it's two different worlds, two different talent pools, but also you're bringing in a vastly different head coach for Alabama, completely unknown to the players, whereas Sherrone Moore is the ultimate known, I think, for the Michigan football players.
And that's not official yet as of the time we're recording. I think they have to have like a 7-day process before they can officially make that change. But literally anyone you talk to, literally any of the national speculation, even Ward Manuel's statement was sort of strongly implying that it's probably going to be an internal candidate. So the internal candidate likely being the guy who has coached 4 games as Michigan's head coach during Jim Harbaugh's suspension. Eerily similar to Ryan Day's resume when he came in having coached 4 games with Urban Meyer's suspension in 2018. Not sure which base that puts Sherrone Moore in, but that's neither here nor there. Let's talk about some of the guys that have been put out there, and this is based on an article called Michigan Possible Transfers to Watch from Mike Farrell, who you may recognize that name. He was the longtime head of recruiting for Rivals. He was with them for quite a while now. He's got his own independent thing at MikeFarrellSports.com. In his Twitter bio, humbly calls himself the godfather of recruiting. So here is Mike Farrell's list. He listed 5 guys, and obviously the list could be, substantially longer in terms of who could theoretically be transferring. He listed Will Johnson, the corner, Mason Graham, the defensive tackle, Colston Loveland, the tight end, Ernest Hausman, the linebacker, and Jaden Davis, the true freshman quarterback who just enrolled. Those are the 5 names he put out there. What was interesting to me here, Tony, is for 4 of the names, not for Jaden Davis, because Ohio State already has 2 5-star quarterbacks in the class of 2024, so they're probably pretty much full there. But for the other 4 guys, Ohio State was on all 4 lists, and I think Ohio State was the only team on all 4 lists, which is weird to me because it feels like, number one, I don't think a Michigan guy is necessarily going to feel like, I don't want to break any news here, but there's not been like great relationships between these two programs, particularly over the last couple of years. That feels like, I mean, it has happened before. We saw it with the Wolverines. We saw it with Greg Madison, Al Washington over the years, but that feels just exceedingly unlikely to me, this transfer portal.
Also saw it with Michigan defensive lineman Chris Rock, an Ohio native transferring back to Ohio State, walking on at Ohio State. That's how badly he wanted to be a Buckeye. But yeah, the way things are right now with the vitriol, and it sure seems like the idea is a little bit much for me now. There are players certainly good enough to play at Ohio State. I would love to know what would happen if Will Johnson or Mason Graham is like, hey, can I come over? And what that would do to the thought process, the room. Like, do you think those Ohio State cornerbacks want Will Johnson there? I think they're pretty good as they are, but, you got to do what you got to do to win a national championship. But man, those would be, I don't know, would they be interesting conversations, or would they even be conversations? Would it just be like, no, head coach is saying, no, we're good?
I genuinely don't know the answer to that, because I think Ohio State is looking to improve its talent wherever it can improve its talent. And the cornerback room is really good. Will Johnson is one of maybe a handful of guys that could improve the talent. I think it's so hard to see, given how especially the last 4 or 5 months have played out, but even the last few years, there's just been so much bad blood between those programs. And I think that's an even tougher jump than it would have been in previous years. I also think, Will Johnson is the name that it's going to be the first name that everyone thinks of. You got to remember, Will Johnson is from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. So that's home. His dad played for Michigan. He's a Michigan legacy. He's one that if he leaves, boy, I think that bodes real poorly for their chances of hanging on to other guys. He's I think, of all these guys, maybe the least likely in my mind to transfer, but you never know. You could have someone, you could get an offer. Speaking of The Godfather, you could get an offer you can't refuse. So possible. Some of the other guys listed here, Mason Graham, he's from California. Colston Loveland's from Idaho. Ernest Hausman is from Nebraska and also started his college career at Nebraska before transferring to Michigan. Jaden Davis from North Carolina. He's actually from the Providence Day School in Charlotte. That is the school that we name-checked on yesterday's show with Mark, because that's where the number one offensive tackle in 2025 is from as well. So it's a school that's pumped out some talent. I think, to me, this is probably a bridge too far for Ohio State right now to be taking on someone from Michigan. I think that's, you may see some of these guys move on. You may see some of these guys head closer to home. Mason Graham, the list has a bunch of, has Oregon and USC and UCLA. He's from California, so the West Coast schools make sense. Some of the other schools on his list, Colston Loveland being from Idaho, Oregon, Colorado, USC, okay, makes sense. I just think this just feels like you're potentially opening up a conversation that doesn't really work given everything else right now.
Yeah, there's too much that has gone on. I think an interesting question that I will ask you, Tom, and might anger some Michigan fans, is if you open up those 5 names as the draft pool and Ohio State had the first pick, I'm not sure that Will Johnson isn't third on that list behind some combination of Mason Graham and Colston Loveland. I think either of those guys would be a better pick, a better fit, not necessarily a better fit, but would fill a bigger need. And losing Kate Stover, if you could just replace him or help out that tight end room with Colston Loveland, or any team in the nation can use Mason Graham as one of those defensive tackles. So I think those two positions would benefit more than cornerback would from Will Johnson. And Michigan fans I know are going to be upset about me saying Will Johnson should be third on that list, but am I wrong? Am I crazy? Like, what do you think?
Well, there's a whole conversation that's not ranking those players in terms of where they're going to go in the NFL draft, or who, if you were starting a team from scratch. Yeah, I think Will Johnson is clearly your number one. Ohio State's not starting a team from scratch. They've got most of these spots filled. which I think makes a potential decision on any of these, if it even got to a point of decision, maybe a little easier. There is not a 5-star day one NFL offensive tackle on this list. There is not, they have good cornerbacks. They're not, is Will Johnson potentially an upgrade? Yeah, absolutely. Will Johnson's potentially an upgrade, but it's a somewhat marginal upgrade from what they have because they're returning a very, very talented 3 corners in that room already between Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun and Jordan Hancock in the slot. And then you've also got Jermaine Matthews, who is, your 4th corner, who is moving into his 2nd year and probably going to be able to take on a bigger role. That's not a spot where they really need someone right now. Like you said, I think Mason Graham, Colston Loveland would make a lot of sense. I just don't, I think there are factors other than on-field production and what it might do for the 2024 Ohio State lineup that are just going to override any other possible conversations here.
Yeah, I think you don't, if it's not a necessity, you don't want to upset the situation, upset the room. And we've talked about that over the years. Well, you can't worry about the room. In this kind of way, you can worry about the room when it comes to bringing in players from your arch rival and what that would do to it might spice things up, but do you really need some spice right now?
One thing the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry has not been lacking in the last few years is spice. I heard on the Split Zone Duo podcast that is available wherever fine podcasts are sold, is sort of a national college football podcast. And Richard Johnson, who is a Sports Illustrated writer who is also has been covering this thing very closely and has been pretty, you could tell based on his writing, has been sourced pretty well in Michigan, said on one of their recent episodes that Ryan Day is known internally in Schembechler Hall as, quote, third base, close quote, end of sentence. That's just the nickname. So, there is a little bad blood there. There's a little bit of spiciness. I'm guessing I probably don't need to explain any of this much further for an audience of largely Ohio State fans and probably some Michigan fans as well. There is a reason we tell you how many days away that game is at the start of every one of these episodes. 309, if you are keeping track. I'm sure we certainly are. I'm guessing you are too. So we'll see who is playing for Michigan in that game in 309 days. We'll see who's playing for Ohio State in that game in 309 days. But boys, there are going to be a lot of those 309 days are going to be real interesting between now and then, because there's a lot of conversations to have as sort of the fallout of the Jim Harbaugh jump to the Chargers. As coaches, is he bringing his strength guy with him? Is who's going to be replacing him? We were assuming Sharon Moore. Who is Sharon Moore going to bring in to add to his coaching staff? And what's going to happen in the transfer portal and all that kind of fun stuff. We'll be following all of that. We'll be following all of Ohio State's, all of the goings on with Ohio State. They're in the middle of their winter workouts and counting the days, just a little over a month away from the start of spring football. National Signing Day coming up in about a week or so. There is a lot to talk about there at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That is where Tony and Kevin and I cover the team. Mark covers recruiting. We got a whole team of X's and O's guys making you a smarter football fan, and a very, 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 very active community on the Huddle Board presented by Jeff Ruby Steakhouse. There's been a lot to talk about there as well. Also, make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. We do a bunch of stuff there. We're guessing there will probably be some additional live shows coming up there in the coming days and weeks as more news breaks on Michigan and Ohio State and everything else around college football. So make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you hit the bell so you get notified when we go live, when we drop a new show, all that good stuff at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.